to be here. Thank you for the welcome. Yes, I'm one of the folks who built the products that you're very familiar with, probably Google Maps, Google Search. I'm a director in Google's user experience team. And I've done this job for about 10 years now, and I would like to give you a chance to get a glimpse behind the scenes today. How do we decide on the products to build? How do we get inspiration for the features we want to design? And most importantly, how do we understand our users? Now, all of this takes quite a bit of a global perspective, quite a bit of travel, but most importantly, really empathy and understanding of our users. Now, I know many of you are working in startups, and you're at the very beginning of your company's life. So what I want to do today when I talk about my learnings over the last 10 years, see how the change that I've experienced as Google grew from 5,000 people to 100,000 people, how that might inform some of the choices that you might want to make in your company's life. Before we talk about Google, a bit about myself, just so you can see where I'm coming from, what shaped my perspective. I was born in the 70s in a small village in the Black Forest in the south of Germany. It's very pretty there. A lot of trees, but not so exciting when you're a teenager. So as soon as I could, I moved to Berlin. The wall had just come down. It became a magnet for creatives and artists. So the city was really a big playground for experimentation. And I enrolled in art school, which was a fantastic time. At the same time, though, the internet really took off. This was the late 90s now. So I wanted to go deeper into computer science and engineering. I moved to London to do a PhD in computer science. With all this, it's not a huge surprise that I ended up in Silicon Valley at some point in the early 2000s at a small company at the time called Google. Now, these different experiences gave me different perspectives: small village life, big city, Germany, the UK, and the United States. But importantly, I had one foot in engineering and the other foot in design. And that gave me a lot of empathy for our colleagues, but also for our users. Enough about me. Let's talk about Google for a bit. Google was founded in '98. We just celebrated our 20th birthday in September last year. It was founded by two PhD students in Stanford, Larry and Sergey. This was our first office, the proverbial Silicon Valley garage. Not very glamorous, not much resources went into interior design, obviously. It's, by the way, Susan Wojcicki's garage, and she's still with Google. She now runs YouTube. Now, while we didn't put a lot of emphasis on interior design, there was a huge focus on engineering excellence. Right from the beginning, Google was very, very focused on speed and reliability. What might be less well known is that from the very beginning there was also very strong user focus. So what you see behind me is the first entry in our founding charter, 10 things we know to be true. And importantly, that's not just empty words, that's really what the company lived by from the very beginning. So that focus on speed, it's really so that Google can get out of the way and our users can get to their results as quickly as possible. Similarly, if you think about the white homepage with the single search box, that focus on simple design was also there to make it as easy and as quick as possible for people to get what they needed. But that focus on user-centeredness was actually going even deeper. So Marissa Mayer, one of the engineers in the founding team of Google, she told me the story how in the very early days, Google would go to some basement in Stanford and test the prototypes that they had, the new designs for the search result page, and get feedback directly from Stanford students or from members of the public. So there was a strong focus on direct customer or direct user interaction from the very beginning. So Google had this DNA around simplicity and user focus from the very early days. That later translated into a considerable investment in these usability labs. What you see behind me is a lab where we test prototypes before we release them. The photo is historic, it's old. It's from the early 2000s when I joined. So we had simulated desktop environments, desktop computers, artificial light, no windows, artificial plant in the corner as well. So I spent a lot of time in these offices to do usability tests, to write reports for our designers and for our engineers to improve our products. Of course, these labs were in our offices, so the people that we would invite to do these tests were quite similar to us, had similar life experiences. So if you look at my extremely simplified product development graph, what you can see is that we had a strong user focus, but it was very much at the end, just before launch. So we would get feedback from our users for our products to improve them, but we could not fundamentally improve product direction at that time. Let's fast forward. So this is 2009 now, 11 years after Google was founded. At that time, I started leading the user research team for Google Maps. And one of the first projects that landed on my lap was improving driving directions. Now, if you think back to that time in the 2000s, people were not quite yet navigating with their phones, so they would often go on their desktop computers to look up directions and then print them out. And this is how driving directions looked late in the 2000s. You don't need to be an expert to see that this is worthy of improvement. It's very clear that it could be quite a lot better. So we had all these well-equipped usability labs that I showed you earlier, but it seemed wrong to just study wayfinding seated in a windowless lab without being out in the city. So what we did instead, we took tours to cities in North America, to Europe, and to Asia. And we would, importantly, not just do this with the UX team, but we would take our engineers and our designers and our product managers with us. So we would just throw everyone out into the streets to get lost and do some wayfinding themselves. And this is how we were doing these tours with our team members. Very low-tech, paper-based notes, just be there and experience it. And this is how Google Maps looked 2 or 3 months later. As you can see, we've added street names. That does matter. But from your own experience, you might recall that street names are not that useful for wayfinding because the street signs might be obscured. There might be multiple names for a given street. So if you think about how you would be giving directions here, let's say in Barcelona, to someone you meet in the street, you would say, go down the street towards the church, then turn right at the tram stop. So you would use landmarks. And we've incorporated those landmarks in our directions. You can see them under the bolded direction steps. So very clear insight from direct immersion, direct experience out in the field that translated then into product innovation. Now, these strips have become entirely standard. We do these all the time. We do them, again, not just in the States, but globally, and we do them with our full team. So it's really how we do product development now. Here's a snap from a recent trip. We, again, went back to India here, had our team members go to some of the mega cities in India, and importantly on this trip, we had them travel with many different modes of transport, rickshaws, mopeds, car, foot, everything. We had them use Google Maps, but we also had them use different local apps, and we just had them experience city life, and some of them actually got lost. Very memorable experiences for some of them. We did this just before our annual product planning cycle, which means that everyone came back and had fresh memories and very strong memories from these trips. And here's an example of what came out of these trips. On the left side, you see two-wheeler navigation, which is a navigation mode specifically for two-wheelers, mopeds, rickshaws, and so on. And of course, this makes sense, because if you're in a city that's often clogged with traffic, if you're in one of those smaller vehicles, you can get around, you can take routes that cars would not be able to take. So it makes a huge difference to have this special directions mode. It's hugely popular in India, and we are now rolling this out in other locations as well. What you see on the right side is Google Go. It's a search app for Android Go phones. And you can see already it looks quite different from how a normal search app would look. And again, this app was built in close collaboration with our users. We actually built over 30 prototypes before we released this app and tested those prototypes in Brazil, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Kenya, Philippines, and Vietnam. So we had a lot of global direct interaction with users to make this product real. And again, we did not do this in labs, but we did it out in the streets, in the homes of people. Just very briefly on the features here, the tap targets, of course, are there, so that's easier to make a selection as you type. As you walk with your phone, it's easier than typing. But it's also really important if you have low literacy or if you are new to the internet and you don't quite know yet what could be behind that single search box. So subtle changes to our design approach here. Here's one other example that I want to show you, which is our lab on wheels. You remember those windowless fake plant labs we had in the beginning in the 2000s? We took them and put them on a van, and that van we drive around our headquarters in Silicon Valley. So these are usually like half a day trip, 2 hours away from our office, and again, to enable direct contact between our team members and users of our products. Now, the van itself is probably not as important. What I want to highlight here is that it's a symbol for encouraging and allowing continuous, ongoing, direct customer interaction. If you're thinking about what you can do within your startup, it doesn't need to be a van, but you can set symbolic actions that make it clear to everyone that you value this direct contact. So if you go back to my extremely simplified product development graph, in the early days, yes, we did have user focus, but it was very much at the end of the product development cycle. Now, a couple of years later, we have continuous user or customer interaction from the very beginning. And importantly, sometimes that is before product development, before the concept stage, because often the inspiration for new products or new concepts comes from these user interactions, from these immersion trips that we are doing. And having been part of this, it's really great to see that externally this is also being recognized. So last year, Google was recognized by AIGA and Fast Company as a leader in user-centered design and design excellence, which is very nice because engineering excellence is something we've been known for a while, but it's great to see that we have now evolved our design practices as well. So I've given you a very fast-paced tour of Google's user-centered development culture and how it evolved from the early garage days and Stanford basement user studies to today. But I want to reflect a bit on the subtitle, creativity to empathy. And in particular, I want to spend a bit of time reflecting on what it might mean to you in a startup. What are the values you want to espouse in the early days? What are the foundations you want to build for your culture when you get started? I think creativity and empathy are hugely important. But before I get into the why, I have to make an admission, because all those trips that I told you about that led to so much inspiration, very often we did have an inkling as to what we would be finding on those trips. And we had that inkling based on market research, surveys, product metrics, or our own intuition. So the question might be, why do we go through all this effort and this expenditure to send people around the globe if we already have a pretty strong understanding or inkling as to what the findings might be? And the reason has to do with our culture. We sometimes, and only half-jokingly, refer to Google as having a Montessori culture. And you might be familiar with Maria Montessori. You might have a child in a Montessori school. She revolutionized education with a few simple principles. One of them is learning in context rather than just in the classroom, learning from peers rather than just from a teacher, and importantly, learning through your own eureka moments, through your own failures and insights rather than just learning from pre-existing theories or concepts. Now, if you step back a bit and look at what we've done with all these immersion trips in our design research, we've unknowingly applied these principles. And I do think this works pretty well in Google's culture because we have generally a culture that supports learning from failures. There's some reservation about just importing best practices. The other thing that really works well is that we have this culture of good ideas can come from everywhere. There's a democratic innovation culture. We don't have a single head of design who decides on all concepts or all approaches that we're taking. So it meshes quite well with how we're doing work in any case. That said, these principles, I think, are speaking to something that's fundamentally human, and I do think it will work in other companies and other environments as well. I want to dwell a bit more on this concept of eureka moments, because I do think these sparks of insight that generate joy and ultimately momentum, they're hugely important for innovation. But unfortunately, they are not well understood always. In particular, user experience is often described, understood as this fairy tale profession where people sit around in architecturally stunning offices, handling colorful Post-its, having one great idea after the other. Maybe a bit like this. This is not how in reality things work from my experience. Rather, the hard truth is that innovation, that the path to innovation winds through many failed attempts, goes through valleys of doubt, and there's a lot of forks in the road with no signpost. And in order to stay the course in this difficult journey to innovation, you do need the joy and the momentum and the energy that is released by true eureka moments. And from my experience, these true eureka moments, are more likely to come about in situations like this. Not in the office, but out in the world, in the street, or in the home with users or customers, deep in conversation, often exhausted after a very long trip. Because that's when you have the two crucial ingredients for these eureka moments. One is participation, everyone is part of the sense-making, and two is empathy, connecting directly with our users and understanding the world from their point of view. On participation, we can all read hundreds and hundreds of pages of market insight reports or metrics dashboards, but ultimately, what releases the most energy is this moment of breakthrough, and often you need to go through a long period of not seeing the forest for the trees before you have that moment. Then empathy, really it comes down to connecting with people who have different life experiences, who are outside your normal social circles. And yes, that sometimes can be awkward to make these connections, but it's really important to get yourself out of your bubble, to then look in a different way at your challenge and the products you're building, because that will inform how you address and how you build for true user need. Now, because of these eureka moments are so powerful, we were thinking about how can we port some of the magic of these field trips into the everyday in our day-to-day in the office. And what we thought of is connecting back to those early days when the founding team did their own user interviews in the Stanford basement. So we're thinking how we can create some of that spirit, even in a small way, every day. And what we started doing is we're inviting our customers, our users, for half-day sessions to our office, where we invite them to teach back our products to us, to our designers, to our engineers. And I've run many of these sessions myself. We have typically 20 or 30 people in the room, and they have been some of the most gratifying moments of my career. Because what you typically get in the morning, you have like 20 or 30 somewhat doubtful colleagues in the room. They're like, well, I've built this product. What can I learn about this? But then you get the customers in, they spend 1 or 2 hours together, and the energy changes. There's a complete flip in the room. Preconceptions are shattered, worldviews changed, and a lot of energy is released. And then when we do the debriefing at the end of the day, you wouldn't believe the amount of new ideas, the commitment to making true change. It really is a very powerful experience, and it's extremely simple. It just takes half a day. So that's something that we've done with about 2,000 colleagues so far, and we're continuing to scale this program throughout the entire company. And again, it's a very simple step. Just go back to your cultural DNA and connect that and update that for whatever is right at your current scale. So if you're in a startup, again, think about how you can instill an early culture of direct contact and then how you maintain that as you grow. Now, there's one thing that I want to emphasize, of course, which is most of my talk was spent talking about the importance of direct human connection. That's only one side of the coin. Google, like many other companies, we place a lot of emphasis on product metrics, and we tie our goals very, very closely to these metrics. But there's a danger. Metrics are ever easier to come by. It's very easy to define them. So we might go down a path where we measure what can be counted rather than what counts. So we need to instead focus very actively on defining what matters and then measuring that. And I do believe that defining what matters truly requires the human powers of creativity, insight, and ultimately empathy as well. And again, I think this is hugely important for your startups, because whatever metrics you set now, they will be the cultural DNA for your company. If you have a separate value statement that is not aligned with these metrics, your company will optimize for the metrics. So be very careful with this. Here's one example, again from Google. About 5 years ago, we injected a couple of questions in our annual company survey called Google Geist. They were focused on things like product quality, user-centered design, and so on. 5 years ago, but even today, every year, top company goals are now tied to these questions. So it's a very simple change, but it has a big momentum and big leverage. Just to give you one example, this is one of the outcomes of these goals. we agreed that we need to align on a common set of principles around product quality. Everyone had been talking about, oh, Google is simple, Google is intuitive. So we had a vague understanding, but we wanted to codify this and make sure that across design, product management, as well as engineering, we do truly agree on what these things mean. And we are now teaching those principles to everyone who joins the product org as part of onboarding workshops. Importantly, we've also worked with HR, so these are now part of our promotion criteria. So if you want to get promoted, you have to show that your work is actually in support of these principles. So this brings me to the final slide. I think it's a nice summary of what I've learned over the last 10 years of leading user experience teams at Google. Everything is constantly in change. The technologies we work with are changing. Assistive technologies right now, conversation design, machine learning. The one thing that remains constant, though, is our focus on the user and our commitment to reinterpreting that focus for every stage of our journey. So for Google, this has meant encouraging direct interaction with users in big and small ways, creating the right metrics, but also aligning on a few principles. For example, if our culture wouldn't value direct engagement with users, we wouldn't have taken the field trips or the immersion trips that led ultimately to new product features such as landmark navigation, two-wheeler directions, or tab-based search in Google Go. The journey that you're taking with your startups will be very different, and the values and the principles you agree on as well. But it's really important to be extremely conscious about this from the very beginning of your company's life, and then also to make sure that you evolve this for every stage of the journey, because it's very easy to let go of these principles if you suddenly have tripled, quadrupled, or grown tenfold. So be very conscious about this. I'd love to continue the conversation. I'll be around later today. Please get in touch, and with that, thank you very much.